6 running backs, I'll tell you if I'm starting them or sitting them. A lot of people are going to question Najee Harris on Monday Night Football against the Browns. But historically, Najee Harris has had a lot of success against the Cleveland Browns. He scored in every single game against them and averages over 100 yards total against the Browns in his career. Najee Harris, a very good bet to bounce back this week and is a must start for me. Don't just assume Joshua Kelly can just go into your starting lineup. Although Austin Ekeler might be banged up for this game, Joshua Kelly up against a very tough Tennessee front seven. Add in the fact that Joshua Kelly really isn't a true pass catcher and that this Chargers team is going to take deep shots against the Tennessee secondary that is kind of suspect. Joshua Kelly is a sit for me this week. Dameon Pierce up against a Colts team that gave up the 8th most points fantasy-wise to running backs last year and just gave up 100 total yards and a touchdown to Travis Etienne last week. He played 48% of the snaps last week, which is kind of concerning, but this is a bounce-back game for Dameon Pierce. Must start. Kyren Williams was a popular pickup this week as well. He's not somebody I'm interested in starting this week against a vaunted 49er defense. Niners were first against running backs last year, and it looks like they're on trajectory to be the same this year. I'm sitting Kyren Williams and Cam Akers. Rachaad White has a plus matchup against the Bears. This is an easy one. I think a lot of fantasy analysts are going to say start Rachaad White, as they should. The Bears defense is trash. He had a disappointing game against the Vikings, but the snap share was encouraging. I get him in your lineups. Wide receiver starts and sits for week 2 of fantasy football. My start of the week at wide receiver is Deebo Samuel. Now, a lot of people are going to look at Brandon Ayuk's performance and instantly put him in here as the must-start candidate of the week. But historically, Deebo Samuel's had very good success against this Rams team, especially in the last 4 games, since Aaron Donald started running his mouth. We saw Deebo be using the run game week 1, and all offseason, this Niner team said they're going to have different players be their main guy each week. I'm betting it's Deebo this week. He's a must-start for me. On the sit list for me this week is Michael Pittman, who draws a tough matchup against Texans' Derek Stingley. I like Michael Pittman as a wide receiver 3, but this is a tough matchup with a limited ceiling. The Texans were 3rd against receivers last year in fantasy, and it's probably going to be a slower day for Michael Pittman. T. Higgins coming off of an 8-target game with no catches up against a Baltimore team who he's been up and down against his entire career. But the difference is this Baltimore team doesn't have Marcus Peters anymore, and Marlon Humphrey is banged up. We saw Texans receivers have their way last week against the Ravens, and I think T. Higgins is in for a massive bounce back. He's a must-start for me this week. Terry McLaurin up against the Denver Broncos and Patrick Surtain, we know what this is. The Broncos were number 1 against receivers last year. So yeah, Terry McLaurin, you might not want to put him in your lineups. As the number 2 receiver, Jahan Dotson has some sneaky upside this week. Nico Collins up against the Indianapolis Colts. After seeing 11 targets last week, there's no reason to think that Nico Collins can't duplicate his performance against the Indianapolis Colts team that was just shredded by Calvin Ridley. Of course, Nico Collins is not Calvin Ridley, but when you get 6 catches for 80 yards, there's some upside here. He's a flex play for me this week. Get him in your lineups. And the last one for me is George Pickens against the Browns. It's easy to assume with Deontay Johnson out that George Pickens is just going to have this massive increase in performance. He'll be better, but this is a tough matchup against a Browns defense that just shut down T. Higgins last week. I'm sure he'll have some crazy big play. It's Monday Night Football and it's George Pickens, but I'd sit him this week if I had better options. Week 2, tight end starts and sits. One of my starts of the week is Logan Thomas, which is kind of a dart throw, just like the Hayden Hurst call that I had last week. In week 1, he led the Commanders in targets with 8 targets, and it's going to be a good game against a very good Broncos secondary that's going to be shutting down the receivers. Fire up Logan Thomas in 12-team leagues or deeper. I'm not really interested at all in Dalton Schultz, who has a matchup against the Colts. It wouldn't surprise me if he had a couple catches, but I think you can find better options. 2 catches for 4 yards on 4 targets last week. Not really interested in Dalton Schultz, now or later. Hunter Henry is an interesting play because it feels like if he doesn't get a touchdown, he's probably not as valuable. But with Bill O'Brien's offense depending on the tight end, and him stepping up as the number 1 tight end of the week last week, I think this is a good start. The tight end being such a dart throw, I think he's a decent play in 12-man leagues if you need him. I'm sitting Tyler Higbee this week up against the 49ers. Y'all seen that hit on Pat Freiermuth. Receiver stepped up in a major way for the Rams in week 1, and I think they do it again against the Niners because if you're going to beat them, that's where it is. Van Jefferson is sneaky play at wide receiver, by the way. I would start Cole Kmet against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last year, the Bucs allowed the 4th most points to tight ends, and last week, TJ Hawkinson had 8 catches against them. Not to mention the fact that this Chicago Bears offensive line is trash, and Justin Fields has to get some completions somehow. Cole Kmet is very startable in 12-team leagues. And my last fade is Hayden Hurst going up against the Saints. There's one thing we learned last year and week 1, you don't start tight ends against the Saints. It was a great matchup for him against the Falcons. I'm not expecting a repeat performance this week from him. Keep Hayden Hurst on your bench. I ain't gonna lie, tight end is a dart throw this year. Good luck.